The Ottoman Empire was run by gardeners, not generals, not viziers, not scholars, gardeners. Guys who pruned roses and trimmed hedges somehow clawed their way into the halls of power, whispered in sultans' ears, and decided who lived and who died. They were a shadow government hiding behind flower beds and topiary, and nobody saw it coming. That's the story anyway. And it is almost entirely wrong. The truth about the Bostancı Corps is stranger, more deliberate, and far more unsettling than any conspiracy theory about rogue landscapers. Because these men didn't secretly infiltrate the Ottoman government. They were the government, openly, by design, and with the full blessing of the Sultan himself. The question isn't how gardeners seized power. The question is why the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean deliberately handed power to men whose official job title involved watering plants. Here's the version of this story that floats around the internet. The Ottoman sultans employed a large corps of palace gardeners called the Bostancı. Over time, because they had access to the inner palace grounds, these gardeners gradually accumulated influence. They eavesdropped on conversations. They built networks. They leveraged their proximity to power until, almost by accident, they became kingmakers, a kind of horticultural deep state operating right under the sultan's nose. It's a fantastic narrative. It's got everything: humble origins, secret power, dramatic irony, a sultan trembling before the man who trims his hedges. And versions of this story pop up in listicles, Reddit threads, and history podcasts constantly. The Bostancı are often presented alongside other weird historical facts as proof that history is stranger than fiction. But this framing gets the story backwards. It assumes the Bostancı started as simple gardeners and then mission crept their way into political power. It treats their authority as some kind of accident or exploit, as if they found a glitch in the Ottoman system and nobody patched it. The reality is that the system was built this way on purpose. And understanding why reveals something profound about how the Ottoman Empire actually functioned. Let's start with the name. Bostancı does indeed translate roughly to gardener. The word comes from bostan, meaning garden or vegetable patch. And yes, members of the Bostancı Corps genuinely did maintain the imperial gardens. The grounds of Topkapı Palace were enormous, hundreds of acres of meticulously designed landscapes, orchards and kitchen gardens. Somebody had to tend them, and the Bostancı did. But here's what most retellings leave out. The Bostancı were not recruited from local nurseries. They were products of the Devşirim system, the same pipeline that produced the Janissaries. Young Christian boys, primarily from the Balkans, were taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained for imperial service. The most physically impressive and intellectually promising were funneled into elite palace roles. Some became Janissaries, some became palace pages, and some became Bostancı. These were not civilians who happened to work near the Sultan. They were trained military slaves. The Ottoman term is kul, bound to the Sultan personally, with no family ties, no tribal loyalties, and no power base outside the palace. They were selected precisely because they owed everything to the throne and nothing to anyone else. From day one, the Bostancı were instruments of imperial authority dressed in gardening clothes. Their corps numbered anywhere from 2,000 to over 5,000 men at various points in Ottoman history. That's not a gardening crew. That's a small army. And their duties reflected that scale. Yes, the Bostancı maintained gardens. They also rowed the imperial barges. They patrolled the entire shoreline of the Bosphorus and the Sea of Marmara, functioning as a coast guard. They policed the waters around Istanbul, inspecting ships, enforcing maritime regulations, and collecting fees from fishermen. They guarded the outer walls of Topkapı Palace. They served as the Sultan's personal escort whenever he left the palace grounds. And then there were the duties that nobody puts on a job listing. The Bostancı carried out executions. When a grand vizier fell from favor, when a provincial governor was recalled in disgrace, when a prince on the wrong side of a succession dispute needed to disappear, the Bostancı were the ones who did it. The preferred method was the bowstring, a silk cord used for strangulation, and accounts from European ambassadors describe Bostancı members carrying out these killings with chilling efficiency. They also conducted surveillance. Because they maintained the gardens and grounds, they were everywhere inside the palace complex without arousing suspicion. A gardener pruning a bush outside a window where two officials are having a private conversation is practically invisible. The sultans understood this perfectly, and they used it. The Bostancı were eyes and ears in a court where paranoia was not a disorder, but a survival strategy. So when people say the Bostancı secretly ran the government, what they're actually describing is an organization that openly served as palace guards, executioners, intelligence operatives, maritime police, and ceremonial escorts, while also, yes, keeping the tulips looking nice. The gardening wasn't a cover story. It was just one-line item on a very long and very terrifying resume. The real key to understanding the Bostancı's power is their commander, the Bostancı-başı, the head gardener. This title sounds absurd in English, and that absurdity is part of what makes the story so shareable online. But the Bostancı-başı was one of the highest-ranking officials in the entire empire. He had direct, personal access to the Sultan, a privilege that most of the imperial bureaucracy, including many viziers, did not enjoy. He could request a private audience essentially whenever he wanted. In a political system where access to the Sultan was the single most valuable currency, this made the Bostancı-başı extraordinarily powerful. He commanded thousands of armed men inside the palace walls. He oversaw executions, meaning he literally held the power of life and death on the Sultan's behalf. He controlled the Bosphorus, which meant he controlled a significant revenue stream and the movement of goods and people in and out of the capital. During the 17th and 18th centuries, several Bostancı-başıs were promoted directly to Grand Vizier, the equivalent of a head gardener being made prime minister. And here is where the myth and the reality collide in an interesting way. People say the Bostancı were secret puppet masters. In truth, everybody knew exactly how powerful the Bostancı-başı was. Foreign diplomats wrote about it extensively. Other court officials schemed against the Bostancı-başı not because his power was hidden, but because it was obvious and threatening. There was nothing covert about it. The terrifying part wasn't that a gardener had power. It was that the system was designed so that a man with the title of gardener could have you strangled before lunch. This brings us to the real question, the one most retellings skip entirely. Why would sultans build a system like this? The answer lies in the fundamental Ottoman anxiety about loyalty. The empire was vast, multi-ethnic, and constantly threatened by internal factions. The Sultan could not trust his own family. Ottoman succession was notoriously violent, with brothers routinely killing each other upon a new sultan's accession. He could not fully trust the Janissaries, who by the 16th century had become a political force of their own, capable of deposing sultans they disliked. He could not trust the Grand Vizier, who might accumulate enough power to become a rival. The Bostancı were a counterweight. They answered only to the Sultan. They had no political constituency, they had no religious authority, they had no hereditary claims. Their power existed solely because the Sultan willed it, and it could theoretically be revoked at any time. They were, in the language of political science, a parallel security structure, a second armed force whose loyalty to the ruler was maintained precisely because their existence depended entirely on his favor. This is not unique to the Ottomans. The Roman Praetorian Guard followed a similar logic. So did the Soviet KGB relative to the regular military. Rulers throughout history have created competing security organizations to prevent any single group from becoming powerful enough to overthrow them. The Bostancı fit neatly into this pattern, and their gardening duties were not a quirk, they were a feature. Keeping the title humble kept the position from attracting the kind of aristocratic ambition that made other offices dangerous. Of course, the irony is that the system didn't always work. There were Bostancı-başıs who abused their position, who enriched themselves through corruption, who played factional politics with deadly skill. The very proximity to the Sultan that made them useful also made them dangerous. More than one Bostancı-başı was himself executed when a Sultan decided the gardener had grown too tall and needed pruning. So the next time you see a headline about Ottoman gardeners secretly running an empire, you'll know the real story is both less mysterious and more fascinating. They weren't a shadow government. They were a deliberately constructed instrument of autocratic control, hiding in plain sight behind a job title so mundane that people 6 centuries later still can't believe it was real. But here's something to chew on. The Bostancı weren't the only Ottoman institution where the title and the actual function were wildly mismatched. There was another group inside Topkapı Palace, the cage. It was the room where Ottoman princes were locked away, sometimes for decades, to prevent succession wars. Some of those princes emerged from the cage to become sultan. And what years of total isolation did to their minds and to the empire they then ruled is a story that deserves its own deep dive. If that sounds like something you want to hear about, the best way to make sure you don't miss it is to subscribe to this channel right now. Think of it as planting a seed. Except unlike the Bostancı, I promise not to strangle anyone with a silk cord.